who has just donated £10. Thank you very much, Silverley. Our very own Silverley, who has for you some animal tales of Britain. So I will leave you in his capable paws. Please enjoy the show.
Greetings everyone, and welcome to Animal Tales of Britain. In this section, I will be sharing stories of a small selection of animals whose tales and deeds are entwined with the history of these islands. Animals have been part of our history right from the beginning. The majesty and wisdom of these wild creatures have long inspired us. The sight of hare galloping across a ploughed field, or of red squirrel leaping from branch to branch, speaks to the animal nature in all of us. In time, some animals came to serve humans as companions, as beasts of burden, as sources of food and hide and horn, which humans used for their clothing and tools. However, the animals continued to be treated with reverence, and thanks was always given for what they provided. Animal totems were taken here in Britain as elsewhere in the world, and the stories of animals fed into our collective memory. That connection with the wild is, to a large extent, gone nowadays. No longer do wolves and bears roam this country, while others, like the wildcat, live precariously. Children in our cities go years without seeing a working farm, without learning where the food on their plate originally comes from. And yet, amongst the cities choked with diesel fumes and cigarette smoke and plastic, there exist spaces, traces of that wildness, and evidence of our wild creatures. One only need look at the example of fox, at home in the town as in the country, or to hear the chattering call of magpie, to see how nature adapts and endures. But it is not simply a matter of nature adapting and compromising. In many instances, nature has taken charge once more, and in these places the animals, so often a sign of nature's health, are indeed returning. Beavers have been returned to the highlands and continue to thrive, while in the Tyne and the Thames, rivers which were once biologically dead, salmon can now be found. The world has changed, but the animals remain. Our fascination and connection with these creatures lives on too, and as a result, the stories of the animals live on. Our story begins long ago, when all was new. Sun and moon showed their love by creating a daughter. Hare leapt and bounded across the sky, creating a star wherever her paw landed. Sun and moon were proud of how strong and swift-footed their daughter had grown. One day, Hare glanced down from the heavens and noticed Earth. She saw Earth's fields and moorlands, and at once imagined herself bounding across that firm ground and soft grass for all of time. Earth in turn gazed upwards, and was captivated by this majestic celestial creature. It was at this moment that the two knew they were in love. At once Hare bounded across the skies, eager to tell her parents she had found a lover. Her parents asked who this lover was, and Hare proudly told them without hesitation that it was Earth. Sun and Moon were appalled at this news. Their daughter, a creature of brightness and energy, in love with a creature who could not even produce light, a creature of cold rock and inert water. As a result, they refused to give their blessing to the union. Hare was hurt, and as a result decided to leave the skies, to live with her lover. On Earth, as an homage to her brilliant nature, she became a symbol of love and fertility, the symbol of the goddess Estre, whose feast we celebrate to this day as Easter. Even now, Hare does not dig a burrow for her children, unlike her cousin Rabbit. Rather, she leaves her children close to the ground in a shallow indentation called a form, trusting that her lover will protect them. And in spring, when day becomes longer than night, the sons and daughters of Hare dance on their hind paws, eager to be close with their grandparents, Sun and Moon. In time, as already mentioned, some animals came into our service. The first of these was dog. Anthropologists believe this was some 15,000 years ago, and to this day he remains man's best friend, a friend on whom we rely for companionship and for service. Yet sometimes this loyalty can cost him greatly. In Wales, that land of mountains and song, or of castles and princes, Prince Llewellyn was organising his hunting party. However, he could not find any servants to look after his baby son during the hunt. His wife was ill at the time, and was in another part of the castle, so as not to pass on the sickness. Therefore, Llewellyn decided to leave his favourite hound, Gelert, to guard the child. Upon returning from the hunt, the first thing the prince did was check on his infant son. However, when he opened the door, he found everything in disarray. Furniture was strewn across the room, broken, and blood was smeared up the wall and across the floor. The baby's crib, too, was upturned, and the young child himself was nowhere to be seen or heard. And amidst all the chaos was Gelert, panting and wagging his tail, happy to see his master once more, yet with a streak of blood on his muzzle and chest. At once Llewellyn drew his sword and drove the blade into Gelert, even as the hound sat staring, trusting, at his master. The howls from the dog brought servants running from across the castle. And amidst these anguished cries came another, that of a crying baby. The sound came from beneath the crib. Prince Llewellyn turned the crib over to see his son, and beside him a dead wolf. The wild animal bore the claw marks of a recent fight, and its throat was torn clean out. It was only then that the prince realised what had happened, and how Gelert's reward for saving the young baby was death, dealt by the one he trusted most. It was said that Llewellyn continued to hear the hound's dying yelp, and thus he is said never to have smiled again. He ordered a grave to be made for Gelert outside the castle, and to this day you can visit the place where these dreadful events happened. It is Bev Gelert, a name which translates from Welsh as Gelert's grave. Gelert serves as an example of an animal loyal to his end. However, as we know, animals are complex, and not all are kindly. Some, they say, are even in league with the devil himself. In East Anglia, where I myself hail from, that land of rolling fields and wide open skies, there roams a beast whose very appearance is a sign of ill omen and death. This particular beast takes the form of a great, shaggy, black-furred dog, with eyes that glow red as embers. We East Anglians know him as Black Shuck. Now some may be quick to dismiss this apparition as something else, maybe a wayward horse off in the distance, or even a trick of the light as dusk turned to night. But the number of eyewitnesses, and the conviction with which local people give their harrowing accounts, certainly do lead one to believe that he does roam those fields and farmlands. Indeed, eyewitness accounts appear all over the East, from the marshes and flatlands of the Broads, to the sandy open expanse of the Brecklands, to the rolling chalk heaths of Newmarket, which he gallops across with a speed and wildness that easily matches any thoroughbred stallion. There are stories of wild howls, startled livestock, or of travellers on a misty night encountering a creature far larger than a stray dog or a fox. Some witnesses hear the sound of rattling chains, like a poltergeist. But perhaps the most notorious encounter with Black Shuck took place at a Suffolk church one stormy night, long ago. The year was 1577, and in the village of Lytheborough, a large congregation were taking shelter in All Saints' Church as a storm lashed across the countryside. It was the fiercest of storms, the likes of which have never been recorded before or since. All of a sudden, with a mighty clap of thunder, the wooden doors of the church were flung open, and there in the doorway stood Black Shuck himself. The great canine leapt forth, and in the darkness and candlelight of the church, the congregation scattered, while some cowered, begging for mercy, while the ghostly dog dealt carnage, killing too a man and a boy, and arousing such ferocity that the very steeple of the church collapsed inwards. And as the dog departed, to the mists and the marshes from where he came, he took a swipe at the wooden church door, leaving scorch marks which could still be seen to this day. In many ways, the East is an unsettled place. In the fens and the broads, the land lies flat, and the salt waters lap at the land and at the sea defences. Farming has shrunk the already low-lying soils, in some places to below sea level. Floods are common, and elsewhere, at marshes and sandflats, it is hard to tell where the land ends and the sea begins. Down the coast, meanwhile, the cliffs are constantly collapsing, the land disappearing into the sea, condemning once thriving towns like Dunwich to old maps and to memories. Even the very way of life, that rural life that has endured for centuries, nowadays sits uneasy alongside the southern metropolis, one of the most global and all-consuming cities the world has ever known. So in the face of such uncertainty, such shifting, one can easily see why old Shuck has made his home at the East, as East Anglia's very own legendary spirit. In case it's not clear, this is Black Shuck gin from Fakenham in Norfolk. Elsewhere too across these isles, cryptic creatures tread where water meets land. Scottish folklore tells of the Kelpie, a shape-shifting creature of the waters. These are malevolent creatures which lure unsuspecting people into entering the water to that person's demise. While they are sometimes described as taking the form of beautiful human women or handsome human man, they also often take the form of a powerful black horse. Stories of Kelpies are associated with lochs and burns and bodies of water right across Scotland. So to stray too close to the water's edge, when the sky is dark and the waters deep, is to tempt fate. Sometimes the creature already wears a bridle and saddle when it appears, inviting unsuspecting passers-by to climb aboard, though a one-way ride to the depths is the usual result. Children too may be swept away by the powerful waters the creature stirs up. For adolescents, meanwhile, the Kelpie's charm may be more subtle, romantic even, as they lure their victims. Now you may be wondering, why would a shapeshifter prefer a horse form? That's due to its victims, us. After all, horses have long fascinated us. They are creatures capable of immense power, whether pulling heavy loads or galloping across open country. We ride horses for work or for sport and recreation. And their history is more closely related to water than may at first be apparent. Before motorways, before railways even, the canals were the transport of choice, connecting the country in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. And many of the early barges were towed by, indeed, horses. Horses, water, industry and power, all things are connected. But other animals have also been associated with the occult, including goats. Though in more modern times we may consider them naughty as in mischievous, rather than naughty as in evil. Billy was a goat who divided opinion. In the village in Ireland where he lived, some, like his owner, were amused by his escapades. To others, however, he was evidence of why the devil so closely resembled a goat. The villagers had tried everything to keep Billy contained. They fenced him in, they tied him with a rope, they kept him in a stall. But nothing could keep Billy from escaping. To him, it was a game. Each device was simply another challenge to overcome, and overcome it he did. And what did he do once he escaped? He ate, of course. Nobody's crops or plants were safe, and laundry on a line, well, that was just ripe for the taking. And when Billy made his way into the church and chewed half of the hymn books, well, that was simply more proof of his diabolical ways. It was around this time that a young man by the name of Liam O'Flaherty returned to the village. He had left for America several years before to find his fortune, and by all accounts, and by the gifts he shared with the villagers, he had succeeded. When Liam was home, a dance was to be held. Liam had brought with him from the New World a fine flannel shirt of bright crimson, which he intended to wear for the dance. He asked his mother to wash it for him, and by the afternoon it was hanging on the washing line outside their house. The men of the village looked upon the shirt with envy. How could they hope to compare with such wealth and such clothing? Even their Sunday best looked tattered and torn compared to that shirt. However, when Liam went out in the evening to retrieve the shirt, it was missing. But who had taken it? There were certainly several in the village who longed to possess the shirt. However, it didn't take much searching before Liam found Billy casually chewing on the shirt and calmly looking at its former owner. The goat was not concerned when Liam took a pitchfork and brandished it. Billy had been threatened before, after all. But soon other villagers came by, having heard the shouting and swearing, and this time Billy sensed his luck had run out. With the shirt still in his mouth, the goat took off through the village, trying to avoid the crowd. Some villagers took a different route, hoping to head the goat off, and Billy made for the railway. Normally the sure-footed creature would have skipped across the iron tracks without problem, but with the crowd at his hooves, his dexterity failed him, and his hoof was trapped in the track. At that moment, the rails began to rattle, and a puff of steam appeared on the horizon. Thinking quickly, Billy took the crimson shirt in his maw and waved it side to side like a flag. The driver did see the warning and pulled on the brakes. The train screeched to a halt, throwing up sparks, and gradually, it slowed, until it stopped just yards from Billy, who could then free his hoof and utter a soft bleat. His owner, naturally, was delighted. For some of the villagers, though, this was yet more proof that the devil looks out for his own. So far, our stories have focused on mammals, but the other orders within the animal kingdom have their stories too. Our native wildlife has been challenged, but it is still there, if you look. Britain has a wealth of fauna, including vertebrates, fish, and of course, birds. But among the birds, which one rules the roost? The answer may surprise you. This is a story I first heard myself many years ago. One only need hear the chatter of birds to know that they can be quarrelsome. This was particularly so when it came to determining which of them should rule over the others. With such a variation among the birds, how should they decide their king? Should it be the largest, in which case the albatross and the gannet certainly claimed a stake? Perhaps it should be determined by place in the food chain, a notion which understandably was popular with the hawks and the owls. Or perhaps the majority should prevail, and those with the largest numbers should rule. The starlings, for example, when they fly in their swirling, cloud-like murmuration, are certainly an impressive sight. As none could decide, they devised a challenge. Simply put, whichever bird could fly higher than all the others would be named king. And so there assembled a great flock, representing each species of bird amongst these islands, from the largest to the very smallest. And as one, they took off. The smaller songbirds were the first to tire of the flight, and though they beat their wings valiantly, they were soon too exhausted to keep up with their comrades, and they dropped back to the earth. One by one, other birds forfeited the challenge. The ducks, and the birds who spent their days wading the sands rather than flying high. The blackbird and the woodpecker managed to lose sight of the ground before they tired, and the dove made it all the way to heaven's gates before she could continue no more. The largest of the birds continued their ascent, the skies darkening from blue to black as they climbed. The crows withdrew from the challenge, followed by the broad-winged seabirds and even the mighty goshawk. And then, by the time the eagle had soared as high as possible, there were no other birds in sight. Eagle congratulated himself. Truly he was king among birds, and anyone was foolish to have even thought otherwise. And so Eagle was about to begin his descent to address his new subjects, when his sharp golden eye caught sight of the tiniest speck of brown, and there, climbing above him, was a tiny little wren. The little bird had ridden undetected on the eagle's back, and when the eagle was too tired to climb, the wren had taken off and flown just high enough that the eagle could not fly higher. Now in those days, the wren had a long tail, which streamed quite magnificently behind her, and as the eagle knew he was defeated, in jealousy, he caught the wren's tail and wrenched it away. And so today, the wren is indeed monarch among birds. But from that day onwards, her tail had been short and raised, and she spends her days hiding in the hedges, fearful of the eagles and the hawks. However, the other birds do come and visit her, as she is so wise and cunning. Well now, it wouldn't be Wild North without just a little squirrel involved. So here's a story you may remember from childhood. The Tale of Squirrel Nutkin by Beatrix Potter. This is a tale about a tail that belonged to a little red squirrel, and his name was Nutkin. He had a brother named Twinkleberry, and a great many cousins. They lived in a wood at the edge of a lake. In the middle of the lake there is an island covered with trees and nut bushes, and amongst those trees stands a hollow oak tree, which is the house of an owl who is called Old Brown. One autumn, when the nuts were ripe, and the leaves on the hazel bushes were golden and green, Nutkin and Twinkleberry and all the other little squirrels came out of the wood and down to the edge of the lake. They made little rafts out of twigs, and they paddled away over the water to Owl Island to gather nuts. Each squirrel had a little sack and a large oar, and spread out his tail for a sail. They also took with them an offering of 3 fat mice as a present for Old Brown, and put them down upon his doorstep. Then Twinkleberry and the other little squirrels each made a low bow, and said politely, "Old Mr. Brown, will you favour us permission to gather nuts upon your island?" But Nutkin was excessively impertinent in his manners. He bobbed up and down like a little red cherry, singing, riddle me, rut-tut-toot, a little wee man in a red, red coat, a staff in his hand, and a stone in his throat. If you tell me this riddle, I'll give you a groat." Now this riddle is as old as the hills. Mr. Brown paid no attention whatever to Nutkin. He shut his eyes obstinately and went to sleep. The squirrels filled their little sacks with nuts and sailed away home in the evening. But next morning they all came back again to Owl Island, and Twinkleberry and the others brought a fine fat mole and laid it on the stone in front of Old Brown's doorway and said, "Mr. Brown, will you favour us with your gracious permission to gather some more nuts?" But Nutkin, who had no respect, began to dance up and down, tickling old Mr. Brown with a nettle, and singing, "Old Mr. B, riddle me ree, hitty-pitty within the wall, hitty-pitty without the wall. If you touch hitty-pitty, hitty-pitty will bite you." Mr. Brown woke up suddenly and carried the mole into his house. He shut the door in Nutkin's face. Presently a little thread of blue smoke from a wood fire came up from the top of the tree, and Nutkin peeped through the keyhole and sang, "A house full, a hole full, and you cannot gather a bowl full." The squirrels searched for nuts all over the island and filled their little sacks, but Nutkin gathered oak apples, yellow and scarlet, and sat upon a beech stump playing marbles and watching the door of old Mr. Brown. On the third day, the squirrels got up very early and went fishing. They caught 7 fat minnows as a present for Old Brown. They paddled over the lake and landed under a crooked chestnut tree on Owl Island. Twinkleberry and 6 other little squirrels each carried a fat minnow, but Nutkin, who had no nice manners, brought no present at all. He ran in front, singing, "The man in the wilderness said to me, 'How many strawberries grow in the sea?' I answered him, as I thought good, 'As many red herrings as grow in the wood.'" But old Mr. Brown took no interest in riddles, not even when the answer was provided for him. On the 4th day, the squirrels brought a present of 6 fat beetles, which were as good as plums in plum pudding for Old Brown. Each beetle was wrapped up carefully in a dock leaf, fastened with a pine needle pin. But Nutkin sang as rudely as ever, "Old Mr. B, riddle me ree, flower of England, fruit of Spain, met together in a shower of rain, put in a bag tied round with a string. If you tell me this riddle, I'll give you a ring." Which was ridiculous of Nutkin, because he had not got any ring to give to Old Brown. The other squirrels hunted up and down the nut bushes, but Nutkin gathered robin's pincushions off a briar bush and stuck them full of pine needle pins. On the 5th day, the squirrels brought a present of wild honey. It was so sweet and sticky that they licked their fingers as they put it down upon the stone. They had stolen it out of a bumblebee's nest on the tippity top of the hill. But Nutkin skipped up and down, singing, "Hum-a-bum buzz buzz, hum-a-bum buzz. As I went over Tipple-time, I met a flock of bonny swine, some yellow-nacked, some yellow-backed. They were the very bonniest swine that e'er went over Tipple-time." Old Mr. Brown turned up his eyes in disgust at the impertinence of Nutkin, but he ate up the honey. The squirrels filled their little sacks with nuts, but Nutkin sat upon a big flat rock and played ninepins with a crab apple and green fir cones. On the 6th day, which was Saturday, the squirrels came again for the last time. They brought a new-laid egg in a little rush basket as a last parting present for Old Brown. But Nutkin ran in front laughing and shouting, "Humpty Dumpty lies in the beck, with a white counterpane round his neck. 40 doctors and 40 wrights cannot put Humpty Dumpty to rights." Now old Mr. Brown took an interest in eggs. He opened one eye and shut it again, but still he did not speak. Nutkin became more and more impertinent. "Old Mr. B, old Mr. B, hickamore hackamore on the king's kitchen door. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't drive hickamore hackamore off the king's kitchen door." Nutkin danced up and down like a sunbeam, but still Old Brown said nothing at all. Nutkin began again. "Arthur O'Bower has broken his band. He comes roaring up the land. The King of Scots, with all his power, cannot turn Arthur off the bower." Nutkin made a whirring noise to sound like the wind, and he took a running jump right onto the head of Old Brown. Then all at once there was a flutterment and a scufflement and a loud squeak. The other squirrels scuttered away into the bushes. When they came back, very cautiously, peeping round the tree, there was Old Brown sitting on his doorstep, quite still, with his eyes closed, as if nothing had happened. But Nutkin was in his waistcoat pocket. This looks like the end of the story, but it isn't. Old Brown carried Nutkin into his house and held him up by the tail, intending to skin him. But Nutkin pulled so very hard that his tail broke in two, and he dashed up the staircase and escaped out of the attic window. And to this day, if you meet Nutkin up a tree and ask him a riddle, he will throw sticks at you, and stamp his feet, and scold, and shout. And for those of you who are familiar with the story, you'll know that there's a little bit that's imitating a red squirrel call, but I'm going to leave that one to your imaginations. So animal stories don't always take place long into the past. More recently, too, animals have been the heroes of our stories. In 1949, during the Chinese Civil War, a British fleet was sailing down the Yangtze River on a diplomatic mission. After misinterpreting and thus ignoring a warning from the People's Liberation Army, the fleet came under fire. On board the frigate HMS Amethyst, the captain Lieutenant Commander Skinner was killed, and many others were injured, including the ship's cat, Simon. For 10 weeks the ship was stranded mid-river. The conditions were hot and humid on the Yangtze, and the rat infestation was able to take hold. Food was already in limited supply, and was at risk of being completely run out. Simon had taken shrapnel wounds to his legs, and his back and face were burnt. However, he remained the only thing standing between the rats and the supply for the sailors. Now these rats, they were big, and they were mean, and they were hungry. And some of them had even ventured to attack the sailors on board. But Simon fearlessly hunted them down. There was one rat that was particularly vicious, and the crew nicknamed him Mao Zedong, and he carried out attack after attack on the food supply. And when Simon killed the rat, the crew promoted Simon to able seaman in recognition of his achievements. As the week went by, Simon continued protecting supplies and lifting the morale of his comrades. When rescue came and the crew returned to Britain, Simon was awarded the PDSA's Dickin Medal, commonly called the Animal Victoria Cross, for his distinguished service and unrelenting faithfulness. A total of 73 animals have received the Dickin Medal, in conflict and in peacetime. Simon remains the only cat, while the other recipients are 35 dogs, 5 horses, and 32 pigeons. The medal itself bears the words "For Gallantry" and "We also serve." To this day, and in more recent times, animals have continued to serve with dignity. Dogs and rats are capable of sniffing out explosives more effectively than any machine. Their work, without a doubt, saves lives. One such dog is Chocolat, a Belgian Malinois who was stationed in Afghanistan with the British Army. In the district of Nadi Ali, deep in Helmand province, Chocolat was searching a deserted bazaar with his battalion. As he passed an open-fronted shop, Chocolat suddenly turned sharply to the right and walked in, disappearing from the view of his handler on the long leash. Normally, Chocolat wouldn't have left the sight of his handler, unless he was absolutely certain of what he had scented. When the soldiers conducted a fingertip search of the shop, they found a hoard of explosives, old claymore mines, and pressure plates. Enough equipment to make improvised explosive devices to harm and kill soldiers and innocent civilians. After searching the shop, Chocolat and his battalion continued searching along the street running through the bazaar. Minutes later, they spotted another explosive. It was then they realised the whole area had been booby-trapped. This explosive was part of what's called a daisy chain, several explosives wired together to cause maximum damage. However, thanks to Chocolat, the unit were able to navigate a route out of the bazaar and into safety. Thanks to his detective work and his keen sense of smell, there is no doubt of the value of Chocolat's work. The very definition of a good boy. Well, that's all we have time for. I'd like to thank everyone for watching this video, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this weekend's programming for Wild North Virtual Tales. Eulalia.